Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture in the series American Literature Today. Thank you, pianist. You may recognize Jasper Bon from previous lectures. He is becoming the John Adams Institute House pianist. And time may come, I don't know when we will be forced to cancel a lecture if Jasper Bon is not able to play. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome the American dancer and novelist Joan Brady. Welcome, Miss Brady. We hope that you're enjoying this short visit to Amsterdam, and it must be quite a change of scenery from your new homeland, England. My name is Anne Wertheim, and I'm the director of the John Adams Institute and organizer of the lecture series American Literature Today and American Focus. As many of you present here tonight may know, our institute organizes about 10 lectures per year, featuring prominent as well as beginning American authors to Amsterdam. If you would like to know more about this information or be on our mailing list, information is in the hall in the little black folder. Miss Brady's latest book, Death Comes for Peter Pan, has recently been translated by De Geus. The English edition by Stekker and Warburg has also just rolled from the presses, and I would like to thank De Geus for their assistance and for helping to make this evening possible. Miss Brady will be introduced by Tracy Metz. Welcome, Tracy. Tracy is journalist with NRC Handelsblad, and for your information, she is the one of the editors of the Hollands Dagboek. After the intermission, Ms. Metz will interview Ms. Brady and give you a chance to join in the conversation. You may also write down your questions, if you wish, on a piece of paper and hand them in at the book desk over there. Ms. Metz, may I introduce you to come to the podium? Thank you and enjoy your evening. Okay. Hello.
When I was preparing for this evening, I reread the interview that my colleague Rein-Jan Mulder held with Ms. Brady in Devon. That was April 2 years ago. And he started his piece, some of you may recollect, by saying that he was, to his shame, mildly surprised to have been met at the train station not by a woman in a wheelchair, but by someone who had the full use of her body and who was a lively, perfectly valid person as opposed to an invalid. He had, as literary critics are not supposed to be, almost been convinced by the premise of Theory of War that it was written by someone, a woman in a wheelchair. To tell you the truth, I was very relieved that I was not the only one who had been convinced that the author of Theory of War was someone who was in a wheelchair, because how could it possibly be otherwise? The book was very convincing. I was convinced. I was glad to know that other people had been convinced as well. Of course, I was also glad to know that she wasn't in a wheelchair, but did have full use of her body. Having read most of her work by now, not everything that's available in Holland, I have been struck by Joan Brady's fascination with all the manifestations of the human body. You know that she is a dancer. She danced professionally and was addicted to dance, I think, as she put it herself, between her 14th and her 20th year. One of the human body in all its variations is a recurring theme through all her work. I'm sure all of you who have read Prologue remember at the beginning of each chapter there's a little piece about the nature of dance, the essence of dance. And in those pieces, and in the book itself, of course, which is about dance and its fascination, a term that keeps reappearing is balletic distortion. She starts out with the basis of the human body, and the book is about the process of finding finding beauty in the conscious distortions of the human body that ballet requires to become the tradition of what is ballet. In Death Comes for Peter Pan, which I assume no one has read yet because it just arrived from the press, one of the underlying themes that is related, I think, in a remarkably well done and adept way to the terminal illness of the main figure. One of the recurring figures in Death Comes for Peter Pan is the Corn King. That's a figure of local folklore, a huge effigy, a doll, I guess you would say, made of corn, and all the various people in town make a different piece of the body. Out in the fields, the body is assembled, raised, and then the torch is put to it. The whole thing goes up in flame. It must be magnificent. I've never seen it, but it's a very lively description. You can well imagine how all the collage of body pieces and then this ultimate apotheosis of it's all going up in fire. It reminds you of ballet more than you'd like it to. And then, of course, her most recent book, Death Comes for Peter Pan, is about terminal illness and about the way the body disintegrates. As the Corn King slowly is becoming assembled out in the fields, it's being put together. Her husband's life is slowly being taken apart by the terminal illness that he suffers from. The main figure in Death Comes for Peter Pan, I almost said Joan Brady, but I've made that mistake once already. The main figure in Death Comes for Peter Pan cannot prevent her husband's dying, but she can steer it. She does ultimately take his life into her hands. The book is not only a j'accuse against the American healthcare system, it's also a testament to the power of human will. In that respect, it is a book of all times and all places. It's a theme that when you stop and think about it, which of course I've been doing these last days knowing that we would be here, it's a theme that recurs in her work, human will and its strength, just as much as the control of the body does. In the interview with my colleague 2 years ago, she talked about what she saw in the world of ballet and what it was that brought her to devote herself so maniacally, so single-mindedly to this for many years. She said, the world of ballet is such a simple environment. Everyone knows what your position in the ranks is, and all you have to do is follow the choreographer's directions. Prologue, her autobiography of herself as a dancer, is about not only being a dancer, but becoming a dancer a second time. She dances for years, she stops, she has a baby, she moves to England, she gets married. I'm sorry, that in a different sequence, but you get the point. She stops dancing for several years, loses of course, bizarre control of her body that dancers do have, and becomes discontented with the alienation from the body that she once had. With a tremendous act of will, she goes back to dancing, dances 4 to 5 times a week, of course has injury upon injury, as dancers do. But she does it. She regains control of her body. She remakes herself. And she actually proves her point by getting admitted to another dance company at, I think she was 37 and she passed for 28, which I think is pretty remarkable anyway. And then at the end of the book, in the very last line of the book, proves her point. She's made it. She has exerted her control. Her willpower has been awarded the ultimate prize. She's been admitted, and then she happily tears up the admission form. A grand act, I must say. And in Theory of War, which I assume is the book most of us know best, the main person's grandfather, Jonathan Carrick is his name in the book, survives years of slavery as a boy and a very difficult time on the railroads and the passage into adult life with the handicap of such a youth, also purely on willpower. This is certainly a woman and probably also a family with tremendous character. The final act of will the result, the consequence of the final consequence of the act of will can differ. At the end of, in Theory of War, the ultimate consequence of her father's willpower is that he murders his torturer. That book is translated into Dutch as Een daad van geweld. In Death Comes for Peter Pan, the consequence of the ultimate act of will is that she takes her husband's life into her hands and commits euthanasia to save him from further suffering. The name of that book in Dutch is, tellingly enough, Een daad van liefde. Dood en liefde, geweld en liefde, ultimately are the two separate, far distance poles from one and the same source. And I think this is for my mind, this is the source of Joan Brady's power as a writer. This is what makes her work for me so interesting. Perhaps this is the way it is because she herself is driven by anger. You know, it's funny, when you meet her, she seems like a very amiable person. But when you read her work, there's a lot of, at least her literary imagination certainly is driven by anger. At one point in Theory of War, she says about her quest for her grandfather, going to her uncle to try and find out everything she could about her grandfather. She says, "My grandfather's fury pollutes my life. You feel that fury trickle down through the generations." She says that she went to Columbia, where she studied philosophy, to seek the truth, to find out what my grandfather's life means, because, and I quote, "I have a right to know. I bear his curse." There's a strong sense of fate and of the sins of the fathers being visited on the sons. The right to know is a recurrent theme, also in the new book, Death Comes for Peter Pan. The right to know what's wrong with her husband, what the doctors are going to do, what the consequences are going to be. You feel this strong subcutaneous drive. In addition to this drive, which of course is a fundamental thing that no writer can do without, she's also simply a craftswoman. She's very accomplished at what she does. That's part of what makes reading her book such a pleasure. She's very good at structure, for example. She, in Theory of War, which is a very complicated book, she tells the life story of 3 generations in a story situation encapsulated in 3 days. She tells generations, she tells the story of her grandfather, of the main figure who is in a wheelchair. The ease, I marvel at the ease with which she weaves a narrative. She steps in and out of the story at ease. That often does make the reader wonder, is this really she? Where is she? Where is Joan Brady? Where do fiction and nonfiction stop? This brings me back to the beginning, when I had to admit that I too was convinced that she must be in a wheelchair. How much of what she tells us is really true? I know this is not a question you're supposed to ask. You're supposed to assume that a writer has his imagination, that of course everyone uses their own experiences to embroider on, to make a story, and of course the more credible the basics are, the better the story will be. I know that, you know that, we all know that, but you can't help asking yourself. And you wonder even more when you realize that Ms. Brady wrote 2 versions of her autobiography, one a fiction version and one a nonfiction version, with, I think, correct me, with 8 years in between, 6 or 8 years in between the dates of publication. Yeah. But they appeared with several years of difference, and I'm very curious what happened in between. Brady, through the skill of her writing, through the strong subliminal drive of anger and willpower, keeps us on our toes. And at one point she says in Theory of War, "I'll bet truth, whatever it is sometimes truer when you make it up." She's here, we can ask her. Miss Brady.
here. Can't see it. There is water under here. I will try and do what I can to answer some part of Tracy's question. When I first talked to Anna Wertheim about this, she suggested that I tell you something about mad cows, which doesn't really have much to do with my books, but I come from that area where there are all those mad cows, and she thought perhaps that would sort of liven things up. And the fact is, I don't know anything about mad cows, but I am going to tell you about a scandal. And it is every bit as dreadful a scandal, and it is true. It is hidden, unlike the cows now, which have been hidden for 10 years or so. And this scandal involves huge sums of money, millions of people. The money is both government and corporate, and the scandal is on an absolutely staggering scale. And it's also something that came about, as with the mad cows, through indifference, incompetence, cowardice, and greed at every level of an industry. But I'm very much a late comer to what you might call a social conscience or interest in social issues. I really shouldn't have been. My family has been interested in this sort of thing for generations. My father wrote the first study of the social and economic effects of Nazism in Germany. My husband wrote the first novel that dealt with the consequences of nuclear weapons. My mother was an investigative journalist, some of whose work ended in the Truth in Lending Bill, which was the first of its kind in the world. And all three of them were a part of the group that founded Consumers Union, which puts out Consumer Reports, and that was the very first of the magazines of that sort in the world, too. I have to admit I was bored to death by Consumers Union, and all those soup and house insurance. I mean, I couldn't work up any interest in it at all. And when I did publish something myself, I was 35 when I first published, so I didn't get to that very early either. It was a short story and had absolutely nothing to do with justice or social issues or anything at all. I wrote 4 more stories over the following, 10 stories over the following 4 years, and published only 1, and that didn't have to do with social issues. I wrote a novel then. No more social issues, no social issues at all, and the novel wasn't really very good. The thing that's kind of interesting about it, though, is that I think it probably must have sold 250 copies, if that. But no reviews appeared in anywhere important. But one review had a sort of an interesting line in it. It was, if she'd unclench her jaws, maybe we'd have something. Then I wrote a book about being in the ballet, and that did really a lot better. But by the time the early 1980s came around, I was in my early 40s, and I was sort of casting around for something to write about. And it was then that I thought about my grandfather, the book that Tracy was talking about. He was dead long before I was born, but I had listened to his stories, much as other children listen to stories about monsters and ogres and things. And I guess I thought of him as kind of a devil. He cold and hard, he beat his children, he froze them out, and yet he was ferociously upright at the same time. I also knew he'd had this unbelievably awful childhood, that he'd been sold as a slave when he was 4. And I did know this was an oddity, I did know it was a social issue, but I can't say that as an issue it interested me very much. I did get a grant from the US government for work on it. This is one of these NEA grants that the government give out. And I finished the first version in about 1987. It was called The Senator's Party then, and as the Senator's Party, it gathered quite a few rejections. I'll read you one short passage. that was in that first version, as well as in the version that was published some years and a hefty rewrite later, about the sale of this child. The virtue of this particular small passage is that it was picked by an interviewer in London for the simple reason that it fits into exactly 1 minute. Benbow drew a sheet of paper out from under his till and began to write. The veteran watched without moving. The little boy danced around, peeking into sacks, squeezing himself between barrels, chattering as before. Then Benbow said, "What this document says is this. For a payment of $15 to Daniel Carrick, private, U.S. Army, the boy Jonathan Carrick is bound out to Alva Stoke until the boy is aged 21 years. Benbow glanced at each of the men in turn. When 21 years, he gets $25 and a saddle. Signed Alva Stoke and Daniel Carrick. Acceptable? Both men nodded. Well, then, that's official. Sign here, Alva. Alva lettered his name. And here, Daniel Carrick. The soldier drew a cross. So it was that my grandfather was sold and bought as a slave. And so it is that I, who am as white as they come, can lay claim to kinship with most American blacks. Now, this child really did live the life of a slave. It was a truly Dickensian thing. He was starved, he was tethered, he was denied an education. And what I found most difficult, though, as a sort of overprivileged child from an academic house, was to understand why somebody who had such a terrible background himself could be so hard on his own children. I just couldn't understand it. And this is one of the things that intrigued me about the whole situation, what I was trying to understand, to explain. And there's to myself as much as to anyone else. Anyway, I'll read one passage that was a stab at this part of my attempt. This one was chosen by a television presenter and is even shorter. He himself was thin. The Stokes didn't feed him enough, but his hatreds were fat. Without gods to back him, he fed his prayers on these hatreds, prayers of stature, dark, forbidding, encrusted with the power of a powerful imagination that had no other outlet. Night after night he prayed as fervently as Moses in Egypt for a plague, his own plague, something new, some horror so great that the very thought of it would blister the skin, a plague to come and wipe out the lot of them. He would bear it himself and with joy, just to hear the Stokes scream in agony. But the book that did get published with these two passages and a very hefty rewrite was still, in this narrative I'm trying to get across to you, several years off. And in 1988, while this was still in its old version and still collecting up rejections, my writing career as such ground to a complete halt. Up to this point, I had been as bored as before by all this consumer stuff that had taken up so much of my parents' and my husband's life. But in 1988, for me, everything changed. There's a passage in Death Comes for Peter Pan that describes what I experienced, and it doesn't have to do with this particular experience in the book, but it describes what I felt about it. If you sprinkle iron filings on a piece of paper, kids do this in school physics, there's just scatter, no pattern at all. But bring a magnet up from the underside and there's this whoosh, this rustle of sound, soft, delicate. The filings swoop together in graceful sunburst arches. There is a time before, then polarization, then comes afterwards. Afterwards, everything is different. This process, for me, began when I needed a bed for a dying man. I was in America at the time. The dying man was in an American hospital. But American hospitals no longer cater for the dying. These days, the dying are evicted from hospital beds if they take too long over the process. This is a new development. People used to die in hospitals. In fact, originally, that's what hospitals were for, places to die in. This change came about as the result of a very subtle rewording some years earlier in the laws that govern Medicare. The hospital social worker sent me out in search of a bed for this dying man. One of the places she sent me to check was the nursing homes in the area. Now, the term nursing home means very different things in different countries. In the UK, a nursing home is where you go after you've had surgery to recuperate. But in the US, it's not that at all, as I'm sure many of you know. A nursing home is a retirement place. They're sad places. They're often for unwanted parents that people don't want to have at home. But they serve a purpose, and yet this purpose has nothing to do with nursing as such, and hasn't had and hadn't had for many, many years. The first one that I visited was in this little Midwestern town. It was Midwestern state capital, it's not too small. It was 100,000 people. And what I saw when I went in the front door was more or less what I'd expected to see, more or less what anybody'd expect to see in a retirement home. This was a very good one. There were a few people sitting around, a television playing, sort of smell of institutional cooking. But for the sake of what I'm going to tell you in a minute, let me stress again, this was really a very good place, as these places go. I talked to the manager about the kind of bed I needed, and he said, you mean you need a bed on our Medicare floor? Well, I didn't have any idea what this meant, and so I said, I supposed so. And I said, can I see it? And he didn't want to show it to me. And I thought that was sort of puzzling. I mean, hospital bed, you look at a bed, that's what you do. And I insisted. So he took me into the elevator. This was a building of 5 floors, and we went up to the 5th floor. The doors opened. I don't want you to feel I'm exaggerating here in what I'm going to say now. It's quite the reverse. I'm going to give you a merciful view of it. But what I'm going to tell you is horrifying. It's the sort of thing you might expect to read about in some screaming headline about some third world backwater. And it constitutes, in my opinion, a human rights scandal on an international scale, and it involves, literally, millions of Americans. It's the smell that hits you first. The urine is easy to identify. Anyone like me who's lived for a while in New York knows it well from the subways. There was another component, though, nothing familiar at all, nothing I could put a finger on. It was faintly sweet, animal rather than vegetable, sort of musk, sense of rot. I just didn't know what it was. There were no people to be seen. Absolutely nobody. No patients, no aides, no cleaning staff, no doctors, nobody. I heard a sort of a faint mewing sound as the elevators closed behind the manager and me. Just that one sound. Otherwise, there was absolute silence. No radio, no television, no talk. Absolute silence. The layout of this place was sort of a central desk with rooms with a corridor radiating out and rooms along it. And the first room I looked into had 3 beds in it, and in each bed lay a figure. These figures are sort of difficult to describe, partly I think because they're just so unfamiliar. I guess I thought they were all dead. They looked dead, and they didn't look human either. And whatever they were, they certainly weren't what you'd call alive. They were absolutely motionless. No one of them responded at all, not a flicker, to me or the manager standing there. They lay on sort of inflated blue mattresses, and each figure was covered by a sheet. Now, if you're imagining the scene, you're probably thinking of these people lying out flat. Well, you have to put that out of mind. They lie in a fetal position, the legs drawn up to the chest, the arms pulled in so. And they're frozen in this state. I mean that literally, too. Their tendons have shrunk them into this condition. And they have to be turned from one side to the other via their backs. I saw a program on television last night about rabbits. I don't know why I was looking at a program about rabbits, but here was this program about rabbits, and there were Angora rabbits, and the rabbits were being shorn. And as they put the little rabbit on its back, the legs stuck up, as you'd expect it with a rabbit. Well, you don't expect it with a human, but that's what happens to these people when they're turned, because the tendons are so completely frozen in this position. On this particular floor, I saw perhaps 10 rooms, each with 3 beds. Perhaps a third of these beds were empty. The rest, let's say 20 beds in all, contained patients absolutely identical to the first 3. Now, when babies lie in a fetal position, their chins are sort of drawn in too, like that. These people, their heads are arched back. They're arched back as far as they can go, and the mouths gape open as wide as the jaws will allow. They never shut. The skin on the faces is gray. It's not gray as you think somebody not very well. It's gray like cement in a bucket. I mean, this is just gray, or like that table. It's just, there's no variation in the cover at all. And each one is intubated. There is a tube, which is called a nasogastric tube. It goes in the nose and down the throat. I hope I'm not, I mean, this is really quite ghastly. I do apologize for telling you this. Anyway, what was horrifying to me, most of all, I think, was simply that they were identical. You could not even tell what their sex might have been. All in all, in this one town, I visited 5 nursing homes. Only the best ones. Only the best ones, none of the worst ones. The largest was the first one. The smallest had only 4 such beds, only one of them occupied, which is to say I saw 40, maybe 50 patients in this condition. Every one identical to the others. Sometimes the smell was a little worse, sometimes it was a little better. Each home I checked, each time I checked, was licensed to carry out this kind of operation for the Medicare program of the federal government of the United States of America. I won't go into the shock I felt, but I, who had never been interested in consumer affairs before, began research at once. I found out that the smell was made up of 2 elements. The first, the urine. I'd been right about that. This comes about because all of these patients, without exception, are incontinent, doubly incontinent, and there is no staff, so they are lying in their own waste. The second smell, the one I didn't recognize, comes from a process called catabolism. I didn't know what this was either, but this turns out to be the reverse of metabolism. It is the breakdown of human flesh. What I was smelling was bed sores on a massive scale. Now, these people can't move at all. People who can't move at all will develop bed sores. All of these patients have them, without exception. By the time they finally die, these bed sores can be as big as dinner plates. Now, the official name for such patients is total care patients. They're fed and hydrated. They have this name, and officially, in the Medicare booklets, they're given hospice-type care. But I talked to some people who worked in the trade, in the nursing home trade, and in the trade... Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. All right. In the trade, these places are called produce departments. Now, a produce department is where you keep the vegetables in a supermarket. It's a double entendre. And these people also produce something. They produce money. One ex-nursing home director, who'd been in the trade in Texas for many years, told me that a smart operator could make an 85% profit on these patients. And this in spite of the tiny amount that the government pays, which is literally no more than you would pay for a motel room. It's easy, he said. You save on the staff. Nobody wants to work in such places. And the staff, what there is of it, because nobody wants to do the work, is drawn from the dregs of the labor pool. These people carry out duties that should be carried out by medical staff, and isn't. It's carried out by these people. The government pays all extras separately, care of the bedsores and such, and bills are routinely inflated by as much as 2,000%. Medical records are routinely falsified. Exorbitant charges are made for care and medication not given, and many drugs prescribed for these patients end up on the streets. It's a perk of the job. It's one of the ways you can pay less for people to do this kind of work. These are US pharmacopoeia drugs. You cut them several times, the street dose, and you have a small fortune. The most common drugs are antibiotics for the bed sores, various hefty drugs that are used to restrain psychiatric patients, and morphine for the pain. These patients suffer a lot of pain. I won't go into the details. I don't want to horrify you any more than I already am. But one puzzle is that despite all this pain, no medication to cover it, since the morphine intended for the covering of this pain is appropriated by the staff, the patients remain in a state of extreme passivity. This is partly the restraining drugs, the restraining psychiatric drugs, but part of it lies in the nasogastric tube. This is the tube that goes in the nose. Nobody understands the precise reasons, but you insert one of these tubes in an old person who, say, can't eat on his own, and he becomes passive in this queer way. Nobody knows what the state he's in is precisely like. All anybody can postulate is that either it is like death or looks just like death, and some of the functions, the brain remains functioning. If you look at these people, you'll notice that their eyes follow you. Now, that doesn't sound like death to me, but if it is only a primitive level that remains, you ask yourself, what is the most primitive level? Well, it's fear and pain. But in America, people are so frightened of such situations that they don't come to have a look. They don't watch over their families. Nobody wants to go to these places, so the inspectorate is drawn from the same pool, the same dregs of the labor pool as the people who function in the houses, in the homes. Inspections are signaled in advance. Corruption is very rife and very varied. It's cheaper for the courts to sanction a home and let it reopen than to close it down. I mean, after all, what are you going to do with these people? What this amounts to, really, is that Americans are warehousing their dying people. It's not just the old either. They're farming them. And they're doing it for a corporate profit, just as they warehouse any other product or farm any other domestic animal. There's loads of documentary evidence. I'm not the only one who knows about this. I went to a clippings library in Oakland, California, and I had thousands of articles about this. And yet the puzzling thing is that nobody seems to know about it. It's there, I mean, it's written about. The newspaper articles appear in every state of the Union. Nobody knows about it. Even the journalists seem to have missed out on the magnitude of the thing, and I think the real reason is that the situation is simply so dreadful that you just can't take it in. There are things like that are simply too terrible to admit that they're real. A California state inspector who was quoted in one of these articles saw what I saw. He saw it in California, and he cried out in shock. He said, "This is America. You can't do this here." But you can, and they do. And I think the scale is as terrifying as what's being done. I really don't think a comparison with what the Germans did to the Jews is out of the question. The figures I came up with indicate that something like 1 million Americans die this way every single year. It can take anywhere from a few days to a few months. All the time making enormous profits for American healthcare corporations one sort and another. So what do you do faced with a situation like this? It's a massive violation of human rights. Nobody's doing anything. Or nothing. It's not that nobody was doing anything, nobody seemed to be able to get anything done, despite all these hundreds of articles that I'd found. So I put aside the Senator's Party, which I'd still been sending around fruitlessly, and turned all of my attention to this medical scandal. I spent 2 years on it, and I turned out a non-fiction book which was fully documented, and I sent it to my agent in New York. What happened? Nothing. Nobody, no US publisher would touch this material, not with a view to a rewrite, not with possibly bringing in another writer, perhaps somebody with a name, which I most assuredly didn't have. And as several people said to me, it was an internal American affair. What foreign publisher is going to be too interested? It was heavy on the administrative detail, and it bore particularly, no relation to what was going on in other countries. My agent at the time suggested fiction, but I said, no, how can you possibly turn anything like this? This is just too ghastly. And as one friend of mine said, well, it's not exactly sexy, is it? And other people said, well, whatever you do, it can't work in this state. It's just too much. So I didn't know what to do, and more or less in despair, I turned to the Senator's Party, my many times rejected manuscript. I renamed it Theory of War. I spent another year rewriting it, and it was only during this year, that I realized how much the medical experience had changed me. And I realized that it was the outrage I felt that was fueling Theory of War. Maybe you could say, going back to the old quote about the first novel, that the outrage had unclenched my jaws. At any rate, the final version sold to the first publisher who saw it. All in all, Theory of War in that version was shortlisted for 6 major European prizes. It won 3, was runner-up in a 4th, was translated into 8 languages, got taken on by several book clubs in several countries and became a bestseller in several, and is under a very promising option for the movies. Meantime, I thought again about my agent's suggestion that I make a novel somehow dealing with this medical scandal. And I was beginning to see that it just might be possible to find a format in the thriller genre. There was a very popular book by Robin Cook some years ago called Coma. It was it dealt with some very grim details. It was as far as he was concerned, they were imaginary, but they were almost painfully close to what I was describing. And this book had been very successful. It made into a movie with Sigourney Weaver. Is that the right name? It wasn't Sigourney Weaver? Well, somebody. What? Oh, I think you're right. Yeah, you're right. I had this wrong face in mind. Anyway, it was a big movie, and it did very, very well. And I decided to do that, and that's what this book is, both in format and in pace, is a thriller. It's basically what used to be called an inverted mystery. You begin with the knowledge that the heroine is going to kill somebody, and the book explains why. I also thought of Kafka's The Trial, because the cost of administering medicine in the United States is, proportionately speaking, by far the largest in the world. Practically a quarter of every dollar in America that is spent on medicine goes on paper. This is double, more than double what it is in Canada or Sweden, which are the highest outside of the United States. The bureaucratic machine that runs it is huge, cumbersome, and impenetrable. It's a sort of an apocalyptic monster of a machine, of a bureaucratic machine. And this is what the Corn King is. I made that up too, I have to tell you. But I mean, it's not real, Tracy. Sorry. But there's Dickens, and there's Upton Sinclair, Steinbeck. Various people, other people had done this sort of thing. So I thought, well, maybe it was possible. Now I'll read you a passage from this that sets the underlying theme. This is a reworking of a conversation I had with a doctor, so sort of half real, half not real. He took off his knitted cap, stretched it out into a muff of bright colors over his hands, stared out the window, then down at his shoes. But when he spoke, he looked at her. "I'll tell you something. I've had fun being a doctor, I admit that. If I could start back where I was and go through it all again, there isn't anything I'd do different. But suppose you ask me, would I go into medicine now? I'd say to you, hell no. I'd go to work in the fields first. I wouldn't have anybody I cared about go into it either." He glanced down at his shoes again, then back up at her. Now, if you ask me why I feel this way, I'll say because in the years I've been practicing, I've watched an honorable profession get pushed into mediocrity. I've watched medicine subverted by attempts to supervise where there is no expertise in the supervisor, and to regulate where there is no expertise in the regulator. I have no qualm with doctors who make $1 million a year doing heart operations at $5,000 a pop. I hate to see it happen. But there are always going to be doctors on the make. This other business is different. Here what you're doing is jingle-jangling the knobs around so that all hospitals and all doctors can clean up. You've suddenly developed this relationship where the whole point is cash flow, where the hospital is out to take care of itself and screw the doctor, and the doctor's out to take care of himself and screw the hospital, and the patient gets screwed by everybody. It's a rip-off. It's got nothing to do with quality of care. Nothing at all. He stretched out his cap and released it. I don't know what can be done about the situation. I'm not saying you have to change human nature. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. But I feel sad for the people who deserve better. I feel sad for my old friend Peter, who's one of the people. As I say, sense doesn't have anything to do with what's happening to him, nor does humanity or decency or mercy or any other fine virtue. This has to do with cost, and cost alone. I have a good friend in Totnes who's a very popular English writer, and she said to me, you know, Joan, it's not going to be enough to make a story. You're going to have to give it some lightness, some humor. This is a difficult prescription for material that is this grim, but I hope and trust I've succeeded in carrying out her suggestion. Certainly the English response and the Dutch and the French have indicated that I have. In the UK, the book went to auction, which is a quite seven publishers, every one to whom it was submitted, bid for it over 2 days, and as a result, I'm not going to have to worry about money for quite a time. And it also reassured me that I had, in fact, had succeeded in what I'd set out in doing. Nobody would pay that kind of money for something that didn't work. Anyhow, although it's interesting, I think, and revealing that no American publisher will touch it. By now, it's been submitted to, I don't know, maybe 15. None of them want it. The great American house of Knopf, which is, I suppose, the major American publisher, did offer a huge advance. They offered $100,000 for it, and I accepted it. This was way back in January of last year, and they sat on it for 4 months. They delayed. They kept talking about some woman in Canada. I don't know what she had to do with it. But, and they finally pulled out. 4 months they made me wait. and then no one will touch it thereafter. Anyhow, let me finish with a passage of a slightly lighter nature, just to show you that I can come up with something that isn't wholly grim. The time is the 1950s here, and the character that the story begins with is a young guy, 22 years old, who's got a job in New York as the editor of a magazine. Putting that first issue of the magazine to bed took 3 days and 2 nights. Peter's staff struggled to keep up with him, napping wherever they could on the floor while he worked on, changing this page, then that, then this phrase, then that. Some of them couldn't stand the pace. He forgave them because, after all, most of them were past 30, and they couldn't help it. Besides, they tried. Everybody tried, except Angela Leslie, that is. Angela said a New York printer could manage to put out a magazine without the help of some college passman from Wisconsin. She said she wasn't going to sleep on any printing room floor. She didn't even show up at the party that followed. Peter didn't care. Foolish woman, sleeping is so dull. The second issue came out, the third, the fourth. Peter bubbled, he fizzed. Some days he worked so hard and partied so long that he didn't know what day it was or what week or what month. By Tuesday afternoon, he'd often forgotten whether Monday was last Friday or next Saturday. One morning after one wild night of the party of the night before, he woke, sat naked on the edge of his bed, and was reaching unsteadily for a cigarette when he heard noises from the living room beyond. They weren't the noises of some bumbler who'd passed out on the floor and just wakened to find himself in a strange place. They were too efficient, too, well, what? It was hard to put a finger on it, too proprietary. He crept back between the sheets, puzzled and intrigued. Anybody with any sense, to say nothing of a reputation as a budding crusader on very dangerous ground, would have been frightened, not Peter. He pulled the covers over his head and awaited developments. Footsteps approached the door. He smiled in anticipation inside his bed tent. The door opened. "Good morning." He jolted upright. The voice was unmistakable. "Mrs. Leslie," he said in wonder. He peeped out from under his canopy, and there she stood, Angela Leslie, in the doorway, as naked as he was himself, nakeder considering that he had the sheets to cover him. He wasn't at all sure what to do. It wasn't just that she shunned his enthusiasm for printers and didn't show up at parties. Almost every aspect of their relationship at the office had been as prickly as its start. He thought she might quit any day, and this worried him because although he hadn't told her so, she was the best writer he had. He'd come to assign her the best stories, the ones that without her he would have trusted only to himself. He never saw her outside the office. That, of course, was as it should be. She was 5 years older than he. Besides, every day her stocking seams were as crooked as they had been at their first meeting. Her slip usually showed, too, and wherever she went, she dropped a trail of hairpins from an ill-conceived and ill-executed bun. "Good morning," he said politely, holding the sheets up to his chin. There was no bun in her hair now, blonde curls fluffed about her bare shoulders. She smiled at him, but didn't reply. He said, "Your stockings aren't crooked this morning." "Are they usually?" she said. No slip showing either," he said. She didn't move. He watched her, sheets still up under his chin. "Not a stray," his voice cracked, "stray hairpin in sight." "Am I always such a mess as that?" she said. There was an awkward pause. "Mrs. Leslie, Angela?" "Yes." "Would you, like to lie down?" "That might be nice," she said. Ever afterwards, Angela maintained that she'd spent the night in his bed with him. Peter pointed out that she'd never been to his apartment before. How could she possibly have slept in his bed? Either way, as lovers often do, they enjoyed the loverly pit-a-pat over just what had gone on. Besides, Peter loved mystery almost as much as he loved manuscripts. Not knowing precisely how they'd got together only added to the enchantment of the affair. That's the end of that.
Writing down on a piece of paper, please do, and read it
stripes all over your hands? I do.
No, it must have dried between you and me.
I worked it all off on me.
Yes, I know. I think part of the thing is this stuff is so ghastly. I sort of pull away.
Physically.
I'm not saying this.
When we spoke yesterday, you described life in England as that the English will, no matter how long you live there, always regard you as a barbarian. Perhaps many of us know, living in Holland, know everyone here, I'm sure, knows what it's like being an expat, an expatriate. But being a barbarian in England, how do you feel about the English? How do you feel about living away from your own country?
I like England. I like the English. I don't even particularly mind being a barbarian. I think it has its charms. I don't have any objections to it. I think there are things about England that I don't like, but there are things about America I don't like. But I don't mind that.
How long have you... Can everyone hear us?
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I usually shatter these things.
Do you expect to live the rest of your life outside the country? Do you think you'll stay in England?
People
always ask me this, so now I finally get the chance to ask
it's
someone
so
else.
It's difficult to decide what to say. If there's some reason to move, I'll move. If there's no reason to move, I won't. I mean, this sounds sort of uncompromising somehow.
Do you feel like an adopted English woman? You have sometimes a slight English accent as well, which I find charming.
Well, I go to America and they say, "Oh, you're British," and in England they say to me, "You've not lost your accent." So, I don't know. It seems it shifts a little bit. I think it's just. I think you tend to accent the consonants a little more strongly because you get tired. I mean, when I was first in England, my name was Masters. I was married to a man called Masters. And I used to call up on the telephone to order food, and I would say, "This is Mrs. Masters, and I would like a half a pound of tomatoes." "Ah, yes, Mrs. Masters, a half a pound of tomatoes." And
Well, that's what I said.
So you begin to change a few things just so that people...
When I go home, my parents tell me that I sound like a foreigner who speaks very good English.
Yes, I'm sure, yes.
We get used to these things, don't we? One of the things I was so glad to have the opportunity to ask you things that had occurred to me as I read your work. It's lovely that you're here. One of the things that really intrigued me was the reaction of the black community in the States to theory of war. You read a passage that I had also marked about the fact that your grandfather's history had given you a kinship with most American blacks, a shared history of slavery. And apparently, instead of evoking empathy, that evoked a hostility, as if you were infringing on their right, their claim.
What's interesting, really, is that this was the liberal American's view, the white liberal American view. But I did a tour in the U.S. And I did a bit in the South, not Georgia, but still. There were several black people in the audience, and their reaction was wholly open. I mean, they felt this was part of their inheritance, part of mine. I think it's such a ridiculous idea. I mean, it's worse to say that you're appropriating the black experience simply because what that assumes is that in order to be a slave, you have to be black, and if you are white, this automatically means you're master. I mean, this is absurd. I think it was telling you that the word slave itself means Slav, and Slav is a white person. This is because between the 8th and the 12th centuries, the trade routes that told you that you could get tea from China and ivory from Africa and things, and you got slaves from the Balkan countries, which is where the word slave comes from. And so obviously the word itself means basically white person, not black person. So but this is all sort of on the surface. It seems to be all rather foolish.
So this reaction was, if I understand correctly, a sort of hyper-politically correct reaction on the part of whites in the name of blacks.
Right.
Good heavens.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so condescending, really. It's really, this was difficult, but it was really that. As far
Was
as I
this
could
one
tell.
of your first confrontations, not living in the US, was this your first actual confrontation with political correctness in the extreme stages that it's gotten to now in the US?
Oh, yes. Yes, I had no, I was really taken aback when I was told this was going to be an issue.
Was it an issue, or was it just a peripheral
You never quite know.
absurdity?
I just don't know. I did talk with Marcia Hunt at one point, and she was somewhat affronted by this.
Sorry, who's that?
Marcia Hunt, she's famous for taking her clothes off and hair.
Oh!
And having Mick Jagger's baby.
Sorry.
Yeah, I saw it in your
Oh, that's
thing.
right,
Yeah.
that's right. I stand corrected.
We had a sort of a talk at Dartington, and which is near me in Devon. They have a sort of a literary festival there, and she'd written a novel about, it had to do with somebody who'd been a slave. So they thought this would be a nice thing to have these two women. I mean, they called the thing caged birds. Can you imagine?
Oh, no.
It was absolutely grisly. But I was worried about it because I thought I had been told about this politically correct thing. And it was a kind of a farce, but then, it's a sort of a long story, but we arrived there. She assured me she was happy to talk with me, that she wasn't upset. She assured the woman who was running the thing that she was not upset. And we arrived, and there she's very beautiful, and she has this hair all out here. She's very hairy. And she and I talked together, and she said to me, we were supposed to read for 7 minutes, as I was telling her, I think reading's sort of boring. And she said to me, I don't think we should read, it's too boring. So I said, all right, I agree with you. So she said, what are you going to read? So I was going to read this little passage about the boy being sold one night. And so I said, what are you going to read? She said, never mind, I'll fit it in with you.
Ooh, this sounds dangerous. Yeah.
And then she said, these things make me terribly nervous. Would you go first? And I said, sure, I go first. So I went first. I read about the little boy. And Marcia got up, and she read the filthiest rape scene that you ever encountered. And it took 10 minutes. It went on, and I was absolutely filthy. And then she having finished this, she turned and looked at the audience, and she said, well, now, I think Joan has written a very good book, but of course she doesn't know anything about it because she isn't black. Now, this is the sort of situation that you...
Wow.
This is what I feared, but that's really, she's a performer, and she put on it was a marvelous show.
At your expense.
Well, it was a bit of my expense, to admit. But it was fun. There was no doubt for the audience. It was more fun than if we'd sat there and been caged birds together. Really a bit grisly.
Did you ever, you told us just now something about the origins and the coming of being of both books, Peter Pan and Theory of War. Did you ever consider doing a more documentary approach to the white slavery?
Yeah, I
or
did.
do you?
No, I did in the beginning, but I couldn't even find an entry I went to the New York Public Library, and I couldn't even find an entry that seemed to cover the sort of area that this was that child slavery was involved in. So I was interested in the idea of developing the emotional side of it anyway. So I wasn't terribly unhappy when I couldn't find any information on it. But I did consider it, because it seemed like quite interesting.
Well, the material is well, explosive to say the least.
Well, explosive, except it didn't seem explosive there. It never was even reviewed by the New York Times.
Oh, really?
No, or the Washington Post, or the Boston Globe, even though this was a Knopf book too.
Okay.
Okay.
Until some beer company decided that this was a good book, and then everyone caught on.
Exactly.
It's the way the literary world works.
Yeah, and then this was also the Today Show. You see, because of them, because of the beer company. This is the Whitbread Prize she's talking about. But they put out beer and other things. But because of that, I was asked to appear on the Today Show, which is the NBC's big NBC program, and that changed everything.
Then the ball really got rolling. Yeah. Well, it certainly caught up with you. I'm glad of that.
Well, it didn't sell marvelously there, but it sold well. Not as well as in France or England or Norway. But, well.
Going into the nitty-gritty of theory of war, one of the things that impressed me most was the nature of the book as a study of the character of violence and the character of hate. And I wanted to read two short passages which I think are just beautifully written, very short but incisive, and the way you find words to express a almost primeval sense of evil, I thought was just wonderful. Excuse me.
See, they're very dangerous, these things. They're either too far or too close.
Two short passages. George, that's the person who really tortures the main character in Theory of War. George kept vampires deep down in his soul. Isn't that wonderful? George kept vampires deep down in his soul. When they weren't out seeking blood on the front lines, they ravened and drooled. So he set them to suck dry the people he loved with as much ferocity as they sucked dry his enemies. That is a real definition of evil. And here, when you're discussing one of the first encounters between Jonathan, the young white boy, and George, his owner, the son of his owner, one short sentence: Jonathan waited. He could hear rats scramble across the floor of George's dungeon-like personality. This is a very specific book based on a very specific history, perhaps an ad hoc, absurd aberration of history. But nevertheless, the book does deal very essentially with the nature of evil.
Yes, I suppose so. I suppose so. I think, though, that the evil really that I was dealing with was the medical thing rather than the slavery. I mean, this was what I had in mind really, when this evil that I had seen went into those characters.
This was the new approach that you had, the outrage that you had discovered writing
exactly
about.
So. I mean, I think that's why it worked this time around. I mean, it really had been rejected by quite a few publishers, and it was, I think, it was a nice historical story. There was nothing wrong with it. It just wasn't anything special. And I think the upset that I felt, the serious outrage, fueled it, made it something different.
So you were able to transpose the outrage at a completely different situation.
Well, nobody would let me write the other book, so this was the only outlet I had.
I see.
This.
Oh, how interesting. So one transfers, you can use that same motivation in a different outlet, a different project.
Well, I think it's a sort of a natural thing to do. You get mad at somebody that you can't fight, you go home and kick the dog.
This is the dog.
This is the dog.
Tell me how you came to write both a nonfiction and a fiction version of your story of your life as a dancer?
I didn't.
That's what the flap text says.
Does it really?
Well, no, it said that The Unmaking of a Dancer was the autobiographical version.
Well, they were
and
both.
Prologue was
really no. It was they're both the same. The fact is, that was another slightly different situation in that the Unmaking of a Dancer got accepted in New York. That was the first auction I was involved in. In fact, it wasn't anywhere near as exciting as the British one, but it was an auction and did sell reasonably well. And it came out there, but they knew within a week, as happens with these things, that it wasn't going to be the seller they had hoped it was going to be, and it was all right. I mean, it didn't do badly, but I didn't make back my advance or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I decided I would try and...
You have a week's grace as an author to prove...
Yes, I knew you were telling me. Yes, then it gets shredded, but then I got shredded just tonight. But I tried to sell it in England, and I must have sent it to 30 publishers. And I said, who wants to hear another American lady's climb up the ballet ladder, was one response. Another one was, I don't think the English public is interested in ballet. It's for children, and this book is not for children. So, I mean,
well, there you are.
I sent it out, and the postman would come lumbering back with it. It's so awful, you begin to have the feeling the postman knows what's in there. Then after I won this big prize, lo and behold, it just turns out they're interested in publishing this book. But that's how it happened. They wanted a little bit. I mean, it had been 12 years before, so you needed to change some tenses. There were a few factual changes that needed. There was an assessment of male dancers that had to be modestly upgraded. But there was very little change, really. It was simply that there was this large gap in between because I couldn't find a publisher.
I see. Were you, through all of this, still convinced that you did indeed want to be a writer?
Through all what?
The postman lumbering back with rejected manuscripts.
Well, I was somebody's mother as well as, and somebody's wife, and I was teaching ballet a bit at the time, and I wanted to go on. I didn't want to stop it, but I can't say I was very encouraged.
No. I must say I do admire your sticking power. How many people send out manuscript after manuscript? They all come back and they just give up.
Well, the number of people who have their bathrooms plastered with rejection slips is there are a lot of us around.
Yes.
It's and some of them are quite fierce, but
yeah. Well, I really admire your sticking power, as I said. I wanted to ask you about anger as a motivating force for literature. You have to take outrage and turn it around, mold it, do something with it to make it be more than just a j'accuse. And I personally found Theory of War much more literarified, if I may enrich the English language.
To coin a phrase, you say.
It had a much more literary turn to it than Death for Peter Pan, which is much more a raw scream.
Well, I think part of the thing is it was interesting because I would work on Theory of War, and my husband, who was a very good editor, would say, "You don't want to say this." I don't want to say that. He said, "No, you don't want to say that." So I'd take it out, and I kept, I kept chewing the stuff over and over and over, so it was much more worked in that sense. And after he died, I put all the stuff back.
Can you hear us up there?
Oh dear, forgive me.
Forgive me.
I do apologize.
What exactly did you put back?
He hated all the stuff about the uncle. He just...
About Atlas?
Yeah, he didn't like that.
Well, he's the man who tells the story.
Well, he just... didn't like it.
How did he think you should get the story told?
Well, through
You
the,
need a construct.
Through the other line. He didn't like it. He didn't like some of the things Atlas said. He just he just didn't like it. I mean, his interest was entirely in making the book better, but I think here he was just plain wrong. It was just, I mean, everybody can be wrong. I always felt rather bad about that.
I can imagine. I must say, that was one of the things I was referring to when I said that I admired the structure of your stories, the way you weave generations and weave stories, and the way the I figure steps in and out at ease, and so very subtly. And the structure of telling generations of stories, years and years of life stories in 3 days, I thought worked very well.
A lot of that did come afterwards, because I mean, every time I would stick Atlas in, Dexter would take him out, so I hadn't made the structure, you see, so that this came later, the 3 days and things, because when I decided to put the information, that line of the story back, then I formed the 3-day business.
I see. Do you have I get to ask all the things that you're not supposed to ask. Do you have a whole wall full of stickers with the storyline?
No.
How do you organize it all?
Well, I write it out, and then I rewrite very heavily, and I find it just it sort of works in my mind. I mean, I don't usually with Peter Pan, I knew the end at once. I was certain what it had to be at the end. I knew what the last line was going to be, even before I started, but it was quite a trouble to get there. But with the other one, I can't plot them out. I know a lot of people do, and it seems to me it would probably be very helpful if I could. I mean, it might make things quicker, but I can't. I don't know why. It's just some people write one way, some people write another.
Yeah.
It's just.
It seems to me very difficult to keep the organization of such a complex story just in your mind.
I know. I don't. But it doesn't seem to cause me any difficulty. It's a bit like.
Choreography.
Well, no, I was thinking making a quilt. You know, these. My sister makes quilts, and they have very elaborate patterns.
I was thinking of remembering all the elaborate steps that go into making a final ballet.
Yeah. Well, that you just memorize, the way you memorize stuff in school, the way you memorize a vocabulary list or something.
Do you still teach dance?
No, it's too boring.
That's behind you now.
Absolutely.
Perhaps this is a very personal question, and please don't feel obliged to answer, but I am curious. Is Death Comes for Peter Pan the story of the death of your own husband?
The actual case is my husband's, yes. The story around it, no. Yeah, and many of the happenings there are in fact quite real. I mean, some of the zaniest part of it, the difficulty getting into an established hospital thing, I mean, where you're slipping through one gap after another. All of that is real. All medical references are real. But the tying together is make-believe. And that's the Peter Pan stuff, this character.
And the Corn King was also made up.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, the editor I have in England, that was what interested. He wanted to go. He was going to go there and watch this thing. So I was very careful not to name the town, you see, or even the state.
Oh, we would all descend on them like a troop of locusts.
No, I made a promise that I wouldn't, and so I haven't. You see.
A promise to whom?
To the man who was the urologist in the case. He said he would help me if I promised not to give away the name of the state or the town. And so, I mean, he's dead now, and it doesn't really matter, but you make a promise, you might as well keep it.
But the way well, then it is a wonderful metaphor, the way the Corn King is so slowly being assembled with bits and pieces coming from all sorts of different sources, while all these various different sources are at the same time taking life from this dying man.
Well, also, I think that I had a great difficulty trying to get across how terrifying a bureaucracy is when you face it. Kafka does this brilliantly, and so does Václav Havel. But the thing that's odd is that we think of this as an Eastern European trouble. It's not something that we think of in terms of ourselves. And this bureaucracy that is now built up there is far in excess. I mean, this is a true monster. There is nothing that is like it. And it was that I had in mind in the Corn King, you see. This was the way, and the great virtue of a bureaucracy is that nobody has to take responsibility. All of this goes on, and everybody's innocent. And it is true, all the people you meet, they're very friendly, they're very warm, they're very helpful. They want to help you do this, but this is the machine they work for. They're only doing their job. As they said, Nuremberg. Nonetheless, you can't ask people to be more than they are.
Do you think that the European success of the book will help get an edition published in the US?
I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I don't know whether it would...
No takers yet?
Absolutely nobody. No. Most of them seem to think it's well done, but they feel they can't sell it. Some of them absolutely hate it. Absolutely hate it. Everything about it. I remember there was one series in which series of rejections in which one said the medical stuff is grossly exaggerated, and the other one said all of the medical stuff is so well known that it's passé. And a third
that's
one,
a catch-22, isn't it?
And the third one said the medical stuff is marvelous, but all the rest of it doesn't work. I mean, what do you do? I think they just don't like it. I mean, it's not what you can do.
Feel too under attack.
It's too close, and it is just too nasty. I mean, it's all right here and in England and in France. It's basically a safe issue. I mean, it is a real issue. It's there,
but it's in another country.
And it brings things up that are important. But you can still deal with them with a certain amount of distance. They aren't actually hanging over you. They're not threatening you. And over there, the threat is to everybody.
Yeah.
And who wants to know about that? I think, I don't know. You never know what things, but that's what I think.
Did this confrontation change your feeling about being an American, your trust in things American?
Well, it certainly changed my feeling about medicine, I guess I would say. Not necessarily American medicine, but I think even though I had come, so to speak, from a medical family, uncle was a doctor, brother-in-law a doctor. I mean, this is, you get more of a view of medicine than you might if you don't have doctors in the family. But I hadn't quite realized how little they know and how little they can deal with, and how much of what happens when you go to a doctor is your own faith in the powers that are there rather than anything they can do. I think I was telling you that this story about a doctor I met in England who said, what's so difficult for me is that perhaps 30% of the people who come to my surgery, I have some idea what's wrong with them. Just some idea. He said the other 70%, I haven't a clue. I don't even know if they are sick. And I told this story to my brother-in-law, whose field was diabetes. He was a consultant. And he said, well, I'd say that Englishman was a lucky doctor. I'd put the figure at 10%.
Oh, Lord.
And you just don't do it. I mean, you watch the television, you assume either you drop dead or they cure you. And they can't do it. They're most of what ails you, nobody can touch. It's just too bad, but people don't. I certainly wasn't aware of this. So I would say it's more my view of medicine than of America. What happened there, I think, this is a queer putting together of the law, of American prejudices, legal prejudices, and greed, which is always an element.
Mm-hmm. En de boek is, hoe heet een opdracht ook alweer? Dedicated. The book is dedicated to Hillary Clinton for her effort at changing the American medical system.
That's right. This was suggested by my neighbor, who's a very well-known English writer, very popular, very interesting woman. And she said, you know, Joan, you should dedicate this to Hillary Clinton. Well, I thought it was a joke. And about 2 months later, she said it again, and I thought, well, maybe it isn't a joke.
Yeah.
Maybe it would be the thing to do. And so that's why I wish I'd thought of it myself now. But I took 2 suggestions. I took twice she had to tell me this before I got it through my thick skull that it was a good idea.
Perhaps I shouldn't have given the ending away, but I've done it already, so maybe we can come back to it.
The ending is given away on the first page, the
That's
second
true.
page.
Oh, good.
I mean,
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It starts out with this statement. She everything is the same during this day. Everything is.
Sorry, this is the Dutch version.
Yeah, that's not going to do me any good. Whatever. But she, what this day is tedious. It's going on and on. Yeah, why shouldn't things be different? Why shouldn't something be different today? Because today is a different day. Today she's about to murder somebody, and who's dying anyway. Why? I mean, that's the point. So it isn't actually given away. It's given away on the first page. It is an inverted mystery, basically, in that you have to find out why this is happening. But and how, of course, that's always interesting. How somebody's going to carry out a murder, and you don't know that, and you don't know what the reaction is going to be. So all of those things are in the balance, but. It is. I think it's the third page.
Yeah, it is literally the third page. It's it's the last paragraph of the first bit of the story. Op deze dag, op dit moment, was ze op weg om Peter Kessler te doden, die sowieso stervende was. Wat ze wist. Bestond er iets dat nog absurder was. And then you get the whole reconstruction. I wondered if, I'm sure a book about euthanasia is a very controversial subject in the US anyway. Do you regard this as a contribution to breaking through the taboo?
I don't really regard what happens in this as euthanasia.
Oh.
I think it's murder.
Oh.
I think there is, I'm not saying, I think euthanasia is a very important subject, and I am very much in favor of some legal approach to this. I think it has to be. I think it's a desperately important thing. But I think what happens here is a little different. This is a person who is faced with a situation in which either something... This is... One of the doctors said to me when I was in a similar sort of thing, he said, you are caught between a bad choice and a bad choice. So she chooses one of 2 ways out. But I think when you're dealing with euthanasia, you are almost always either dealing with somebody who has decided, I mean, legally, usually, I think, even in Holland, the person himself has to decide whether he wants this or not. The old approach, which I still think has much to recommend it, I don't know that even now you can quite call it, when the doctor used to give just a bit more morphine, and that would be the end of that, and nobody asked any questions, and there was no, but that was another time, another approach, and a fine thing in its way, provided the doctor was, this is one of those things where there are always little sides and edges, but In this case, I don't think you could call this euthanasia.
Because he had no
Well, euthanasia
opportunity
has to be also. There has to be. It's like the business in theory of war. People said to me, "This isn't slavery; it's indentured servitude." Now, it can't be indentured servitude because an indenture is a legal document. Anybody who is an indentured servant has, however inadequate, a legal system around it. Euthanasia is similar. It has to be a legal thing. It has to have constraints and legal approaches. This was outside of any system. And being outside of any system, it has to, I think, be categorized as murder.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, these are very fine lines, and as I say, it's certainly not to say that I am against euthanasia or anything at all in that line. I'm very much for it. I could state that categorically. But I think that question is slightly different from this one. But maybe it's just splitting hairs.
Mm-hmm. She is caught after she has murdered her husband. She turns around and a nurse is standing there and says that she had better put away the plastic bag. And I really held my heart thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen now?
Well, don't tell anybody.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You mustn't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody.
Well, I think I'd better... Yes, I was just going to say it's time for me before I give anything more away.
Yeah, you're an absolute disaster. What am I going to do?
Please.
No, nobody's going to ask anything.
Okay.
Well, it would... Yes, there are, and I think one of the things that's interesting, I've been talking to a number of journalists in Belgium and here, and almost nobody's read Peter Pan, which is not the saccharine story that comes across with the Disney thing at all. It's really, in its way, rather wicked book, and it's he's a charming character. But I hadn't read it myself until fairly far along in the working of this book, and I was listening to or watching a television program, and somebody referred to Peter Pan, and they said he was delicate as a butterfly and dangerous as a bomb. And this was the very kind of character I was working on putting together, and so I read Peter Pan, and I was really quite taken aback because it's an extraordinary story. And there are a lot of references to it. I mean, I can see why children adore it. It's really wicked. No child likes anything saccharine, really. I'm sure of it. I'm not sure.
Can everyone hear the question? Whether if Peter Pan is used very much in literature, not just for children, but in grown-ups literature.
Well, certainly it's in England more than in the United States, because I think in the US it's almost wholly associated with Walt Disney, which is rather different approach to the material. But I think it's used quite a lot, and in fact I was told later on that there was a play, I think it might have been Australian, about the death of Peter Pan, and it had to do with the death of J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan. But it was that idea is, I mean, Peter Pan is the child who never dies. He never grows up, he never dies. So it's used in that way as a metaphor quite a bit. Well, it's a metaphor basically
immortality.
For immortality, yeah. That's a fine way of putting it. Sure, it's it's more than that, in that it's the child that never grows up at all. And he never gets to be. I mean, he doesn't want to grow up. Every time the thought of becoming an adult approaches, if anybody says anything, he doesn't want to talk about it. We're not going to have anything to do with that, It's really quite an interesting book.
And death comes for him after all.
Well, not in J.M. Barrie's version.
No. Speaking of metaphors, one of the questions we received during the intermission, the book starts with the protagonist leaving a house through the laundry room, where she has to pass several evil-smelling, vicious dogs. She also enters the hospital through the back entrance. Is this a metaphor?
Well, somebody suggested...
After all, sorry, I realize this is part of the question. After all, Joan Brady shows us the backside of Medicare and also a side of American history which it is considered not politically correct to mention at all.
Well, an interviewer as today made this same point that actually it never occurred to me. But I think it's a lovely idea. I'm all for it. I don't like dogs very much, and so I had rather fun with the dogs. that was a separate point, but no, I really. It wasn't in my mind, but I can see it's
but it does work, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea. What a fascinating woman I am.
Another question from the audience from the interval. You say nobody in the US wants to touch the subject of the violation of human rights in the nursing homes, Medicare departments. Are you aware of lawsuits or claims brought forward by dependents of elderly people that have made Medicare treatment in these nursing homes?
No.
Funny, it's such a litigious country.
It's a very litigious country, but I think I certainly haven't run across anything. I mean, one of the things that was suggested to me when I was doing the nonfiction version was that I see if I could find a senator with a parent who had gone through this, but no, I think the thing is there that the whole subject is so taboo. I mean, you're not allowed to grow old in America. It's part of your own weakness if you do. I mean, surely you can do better than that. I mean, this is not true of just Americans, it's true of everybody. I mean, it is what the Germans said in the answer to Nuremberg. What could you do? The authorities said, this is what you're to do, you did it. And I think that whole feeling applies across the board here in America. I do think the numbers are so staggering. Mm-hmm. But then, 1% of the population dies in any year. And this is a general approach, a general sort of statistic that applies across the board. And people have to die somewhere. And I think there is just the feeling that you put that out of mind. It's not your responsibility. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, the way the legal system works in the US, a doctor doesn't have to have examined a patient if he had after death. If he has examined that patient within 6 months of the patient's death, he himself does not have to examine the body. So he can sign the death certificate.
Sight unseen.
Sight unseen.
Uh-huh.
And this law itself is a way of allowing the U.S. corporations to ply their trade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Quick question. Now that you bring this to the surface, and once we've read your book, what do you suggest we do then?
Well, several people have asked me this, and I can only tell you that I haven't any idea. I wish I did. If I have the feeling that anybody who could come up with an answer to this is like the Holy Grail. One of the things that occurs to me as a response to it is that when the U.S. was in Vietnam and people were saying, you've got to get out of Vietnam. And the official response is, yes, we can understand that we have to get out of Vietnam, but how? how do you work this? How do you manage this business of getting out of Vietnam? And George Steiner gave a lecture on this subject, and he said, people have asked how you get out of Vietnam. How do you get out of Vietnam? In ships, ladies and gentlemen, in ships. And I think you need something like this. Somebody just has to clear it away. But there's so much money involved, and so many jobs, and so many taboos that it's going to be an enormous job, and I wouldn't have any idea how you approach it.
Can I ask you and just try to clarify to myself what you actually mean by Medicare? In Holland, as far as I know, everyone that reaches a certain age is entitled to the old age pension. In America, you're only entitled to Social Security benefits, old age pension, if you're entitled to it, either because you work or you were married to a man who worked. And when my grandmother went into a nursing home, I know that she turned over her Social Security payment to the nursing home, and it was what you, like you said, what you saw when you first walked in, expecting to see the people watching TV. But everyone that's old, like my mother, is on Medicare, which is part of the health care.
Not really. You see, now, there are very interesting divisions here. Medicare was a program that Kennedy had drawn up. It was instituted by Johnson after Kennedy's assassination. And it is health care only for those over 65. And if you go into a nursing home, the word care, forget it. It doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. Your mother wasn't getting Medicare when she was in the nursing home. She would not get a Medicare payment until she fit certain criteria. These criteria include intubation, nasogastric tube, and regular hydration. It actually goes to the nasogastric tube, and an antibiotic or morphine on a regular basis. At the time I was dealing with, these were the two major criteria in the Middle Western state that I was in. And unless you are in that condition, the government will not pay. And this is, they'll pay her Social Security. That's separate. That's separate. Right. That's separate. You see, the two are separate. They're quite separate. And the Medicare payment is more profitable because when she is on her Social Security payment, they actually have to do something. They have to feed her. They have to entertain her. They have to change her bed. They have to do something. If they can intubate her and put her on morphine or something like that, as long as it's written down, they can collect the money without having to do anything. That is the situation. One of the interesting things is that Medicaid, which is the program for the poor in the U.S., pays slightly less. When I was dealing with it, it was $50 a day as against $70 a day. $50 a day if you are on Medicaid, $70 if you're on Medicare. Well, now, if you can imagine an American nursing home owned by a big corporation who has a patient who has to be fed and looked after, has to have clothes changed and moved around, and you're only getting $50 a day, whereas you can get $70 if you intubate this person and don't have to care for him. What are you going to do? Obviously, you're going to intubate him. This is the way it works. This is one of the ways. So a lot of these people, half the people are people who in this country or in America would be wholly dead long time ago. They're being farmed. The other half are people who are shoved into this position from Medicaid. It's as wicked as anything you can imagine, or wickeder. Nobody can imagine this sort of stuff. It's so awful.
Did you have a question?
I'm sure you're delighted to know.
Did you have a question? No? Back there? Sorry, go ahead.
Another question. Do you know Hillary Clinton has read your book?
I haven't any idea. No, I don't imagine so. I'm sure she gets way too many. Well, it's a possibility, but I'm not even sure she's an American too, after all.
Well, she had her try at this subject matter
Yes.
already, and it didn't really help, did it?
In fact, it crushed her. I think it was that almost as much as anything else that did her in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know from medical journals around the late 80s, early 90s, there was...
Could you stand up, please? I can't hear you very well.
There were some articles about the hospice movement in the USA, which were homes quite close to hospitals where people could die and where they were taken care of.
Well, now that's a very interesting point.
In that sequence? Sorry.
Well done. Yeah, well, it's a very interesting point. The hospice actually gets a little more money. It's more than a little more. At the time I was dealing with, they got $160 a day, as against the $70 for a nursing home. And the hospices are very often connected to hospitals. But in order to get that $160 a day, the patient has to be intubated. So that you can only have terminal cases now. Anybody, on Medicare that is, anybody who is younger and a cancer patient or a terminal patient does not have to be intubated because the insurance will pay. But if they are older, they have to be intubated or the government will not pay. And it is true that many cancer patients become edematous on an intravenous line. The hospices use intravenous lines, not nasogastric tubes. And I mean, a nasogastric tube really is a perfectly respectable piece of equipment. It's just not intended for this use. If you have ever encountered one, you'd know that after a week or so, it ulcerates the skin along the root. So you don't use this sort of thing for long-term situations. But if you're in a hospice, you have to be intubated if you're on Medicare, but you can be intravenously intubated. If you become edematous on an intravenous line, you have to be shipped out because the government will not pay.
One, yeah, and then I'll read one of, I think it's probably our last question.
I'd like to know about a wheelchair. Why did you put it in the
Oh, well, it's sort of interesting because when I was working on it, here was this enormously angry man who'd had this awful background. I knew that the background was so dreadful. And I myself, I would get along and I would think, why the hell doesn't this guy pull his socks up? You know, what's the matter with him? Why doesn't he liven up a little bit? And I realized that if I couldn't keep myself aware of what had happened to this man, who else could? And the idea of the wheelchair, you know how to react to a wheelchair. You know that you feel certain things when you see a wheelchair, and that people in wheelchairs have been injured one way or another. So this became a visual way of reminding anyone who was forgetting, as I was myself, that there was a serious injury here. In the main character, not in the narrator. That was less important. What was important was that you keep aware that there was a deep, serious wound in the narrator, in the hero, even though you couldn't see it.
This may be our last question, so have a quick think. My mother, 68, is contemplating selling her home and moving to a retirement community with her 77-year-old partner. The brochures I've seen on these retirement communities make them look like live-in country clubs, and they stress the importance of moving in while still healthy. Are these communities significantly different from the retirement homes, and if so, in what way? And now comes the really nice part. Wouldn't a healthy 68-year-old woman be bored stiff and go into a depression in an environment where the only real common element is old age? Or are the activities, golf, bridge, etc., legitimate? Is the urging to join early just a money-making ploy, or is there a good basis for it?
Well, there are a lot of things in there.
Yeah, take your pick.
I think what I'd say is that before signing anything, you better go and look at it very carefully. The first thing you do is to try and smell. You sniff the air. If it doesn't smell good, you get out. Secondly, they are money-making organizations. They are not charitable. When she becomes ill, she'll be thrown out. They are probably connected very nicely to a nursing home, which will then take her on. You can't really advise anybody in this sort of situation. I think if it were my position, I would say, tell her to stay in the community as long as she can and not to get sick.
Yeah. The importance of moving in while still healthy makes it sound as if they think that by making you sign that you will stay healthy, that they
there is that quality
keep
to
death
it.
at bay.
Well, the fact is, the moment you become seriously ill, you're out.
Yeah.
I mean, you sign a thing, and it says in the small print that you're out. I mean, that's you can say, and very often people sign over their entire.
Yeah.
You know, these are money-making operations. Nobody is in it for purposes of charity, and I think people aren't aware that these are basically businesses out to make a profit margin. Mm-hmm. These are not just nice little corporations. Most of them are multinationals. They don't care about whether your mother is happy with playing their bridge. All they care is that they're making money off her.
Anybody? Last one?
Well, in my situation, we ended up in a hospice in the States. And it was, I wasn't threatened with, well, I was threatened with it, but I didn't get to the point that I had to do something. I mean, one of the things that's very difficult is that in a hospice in the United States, if a patient begins to rally, they'll be shipped out. They have to go to a nursing home. So when somebody is very, very ill and very near to dying, one of the things that, there's not much pleasure in this situation, but one of the things that you can get a small amount of pleasure out of is when the person rallies. For a while, for a moment, for 5 minutes or something like this, you might see a hint of the person you'd known. And this is, you couldn't really call it a joy, but it at least eases the process. In an American hospice now, all this does is fill you with terror, because you know if this person rallies, the law says he has to leave the hospice and go, and the only place for this person to go is a nursing home. But there are no nice places, really, not to die in the United States now. I don't know that, it's not the best of processes anywhere, but there is no need for it to be as dreadful as this, and there is no institutionalized method at the moment that is other than dreadful. What happens is that people, forgive me, but it takes them about a week and they die of drowning because they catch pneumonia. And this is basically you drown. That's a nice note to end on, isn't it?
Well, we're all, I'm sure, impressed by what we've heard and a little scared.
Well, that I hope.
Yeah.
I think, because I think that the money is coming here, and the corporations are coming here. I think, as I was telling you, I live in this small town in Devon, and 5 of the retirement homes around there have now been bought up by American corporations.
Well, I wish we could have closed a little bit more.
Yes, I'm
happy, but-
sorry. I do apologize. That is
But
really
there are more
bad.
drinks later. We can
You claim we
recuperate.
need the drink now.
I
I do apologize. I am sorry.
Well,
that was
thank
very
you
bad.
for this literary and sometimes very medical evening, and sometimes also emotional. And I think, Tracy, that the audience and I also agree that you have helped bring Miss Brady's work closer to all of us.
Too close.
And
I'm sorry,
Miss
Joe.
Brady, we're very grateful that you came to Amsterdam and that you have given up some of your writing time to visit Amsterdam and us, and I hope you have a safe journey back tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Have another drink, and our next evening will be with E.N.E. Prue. Information is in the hall, and I hope you stay a while and hope to see you again. Thank you.